is Carolyn Whitzman, and I'm a professor of urban planning here at the Melbourne School of Design of the University of Melbourne. Welcome to the event Affordable Housing in Victoria, What's Next? I'm going to start off with a little plug to tweet the event. We'll also be recording the event for placement on our website. So if some of your friends aren't able to make it because they're stuck in traffic, tell them not to despair yet. Before I go on, well, wait till I start talking about affordable housing, then you can despair. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and point out that this land on which we meet was never ceded. What my happy pleasure to do tonight is to introduce the event and also to provide a little bit of a context. After I speak, and I'll speak for about 15 minutes, Dr. Katrina Raynor is going to talk a little bit about an affordable housing summit that was held last month to bring together some of the key actors on housing affordability in Victoria. Then we're going to have Professor David Rebar to discuss stock transfer to Aboriginal Housing Victoria, which is a little bit of a pilot project for stock transfer from public to community housing. Then Alain Wiesel, Dr. Alain Wiesel, who is a lecturer in urban geography, is going to present some of his recent work on what areas get infrastructure and how we can better match affordable housing with infrastructure investment. And last but not least, we're going to have a brief introduction from Catherine Brown, the CEO of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, on an affordable housing challenge. And then hopefully at the end of it, there's going to be 20 minutes for questions, just giving you an overview of the evening. So we're going to start off by talking about the project that I've been convening for 4 years now. It's called Transforming Housing, and it's a university industry partnership that's convened by researchers in planning and architecture, public health, economics, property development, and geography. And we use a collaborative planning approach to improve housing affordability and quality outcomes. What do we mean by a collaborative planning approach? We mean the idea that a whole bunch of people with different perspectives but who are interdependent might be able to solve a wicked problem like affordable housing. And this gives some of the ideas. This isn't all our current funders, but these are folks who have funded us, supported us through great ideas in the past. And you see it includes researchers, private developers, community housing organizations, state and local government, investors, and then some independent advisors. That's a picture of some of the smiling faces of some of the researchers. In the first stage of the research, we were trying to develop this collaborative and deliberative thinking together partnership focusing on family-friendly affordable housing in central Melbourne. Then in the next stage, we tried to develop a 3-year agenda for action after identifying some of the problems, broadened our scope a little bit to look at all forms of affordable housing and all areas of metropolitan Melbourne that are well served by infrastructure such as transport and social services. The problem that we're addressing, and I'm sure one that's very familiar to many of you in the audience, certainly I see a lot of great familiar faces, is that according to the 2016 census, our latest data, the median household income for Melbourne per week is $1,750 per week, and an affordable housing for a medium income household at 3 times annual income would be $273,000 in metropolitan Melbourne, according to the traditional banking guideline, which is that you should not be paying more than 3 times your annual income. We know, of course, that there are very few homes available for that price anymore. And 88% of private renters in the lowest income quintile, that is the lowest 20% according to those categories, pay over 30% of their income in housing. Almost a third pay over 50%, which puts them in very severe housing stress, a choice between paying their rent or feeding their kids, for instance. In the majority of municipalities, over 95% of appropriately sized dwellings on the private rental market are unaffordable to households reliant on Centrelink. But I find these two slides, and hopefully you'll be able to see the pointer, really stark. They're from Plan Melbourne, which was released a couple of months ago. This is the urban growth boundary, and of course Melbourne has geographically expanded in recent years, and this gives a sense of where that expansion has occurred. And then these are the places that have the lowest cost housing in metropolitan Melbourne. Now I'm going to point out two things. The lowest 25%, and keep in mind that the median income price would be about $273 for affordability, is $415,000. That's the lowest 25%. And let's take a look at where it's found. Here's Cooroorup. For those of you who know it, it's the capital of asparagus growing in Australia. It's well outside the urban growth boundary, well outside public transport. This is across from French Island. Considerably, there is a diesel train that goes here, but really you're right outside of public transport here. Here is in the middle of what we used to think of as the Green Wedge in the Yarra Ranges and the Dandenongs. And here are some areas, and this is well beyond Melton that we're talking about, even beyond Wyndham. We're talking about Bacchus Marsh. Again, lovely agricultural land, but not really well beyond the urban growth boundary, and housing isn't even affordable there. Victoria has the lowest proportion of social housing in Australia and the highest proportion of low-income households in housing stress. I think those two facts might be related. And there is a shortfall, as we know, of new affordable rental supply, which is true across Australia, particularly rental housing supply. So this gives you a few statistics. Again, we're talking today about solutions rather than problems, but I'm giving you the context that this is a large problem and a looming problem, and it's not getting better fast enough. So when we talk about the affordability gap, we're talking about that difference between an amount a household can reasonably afford to pay and the actual cost of providing the housing unit in a particular location. And here I have some colleagues from CEHL, Common Equity Housing Limited, that have looked at some scenarios. For some very low income households, the cost would be the same, $355,000 for a 50 square meter apartment. The maximum rent for a very low income household, say someone on pension plus Commonwealth rental assistance, would be about $165 a week. And basically you're going to need a total subsidy in that situation. Even for low and moderate income households, even if there is support for construction costs, there still needs to be ongoing subsidy in order to meet an affordable rent under current land prices. Now that's the bad news. The good news is that since December, which was the last time that we held a public event, a lot has happened. Infrastructure Victoria has come out with its 30-year infrastructure strategy. And for the first time, social housing is seen as one of the top 3 infrastructure priorities. And that's terribly important because if you count social housing as essential infrastructure, the interest rates or the return rates expected are actually much lower than if you consider them speculative housing. There's always going to be, or there's going to be for the foreseeable future, people who need affordable rental housing. It's a steady investment. Infrastructure Victoria says that there's a need for 30,000 new social housing units by 2027 as part of its infrastructure priorities. Then a couple of months later, Homes for Victorians, which was a Victorian government strategy, Infrastructure Victoria is an advisory group, talked about a $1 billion fund for new social housing. That's a lot of new capital for new social housing, plus an additional $1 billion in loan guarantees with a commitment to renovate 2,500 public housing units, plus create 2,200 new units by 2022. And Plan Melbourne, which came out the same month, talked about the need for diverse housing in terms of size, in terms of affordability, near jobs, transports, and services, although unfortunately without numeric targets for affordable housing. The current state government, of course, is Labour, and the Labour Party talked about the right to safe, affordable, and secure housing, and certainly Plan Melbourne talks about that with appropriate size and location. It's really important, say, the planning documents to have a diversity of housing types and sizes in each location, which allows people to age in place because people don't have the same income throughout their lives, and also promotes social integration as opposed to ghettoization. What I'm going to do now is plug in some numbers in a very basic way, depending on some statistics by ID demographics based on 2016 census. So if we're talking about extremely low income people, people who are earning less than 30% of the median income for metropolitan Melbourne, that's a little less than 13% of the population of households. It's about 200,000 people. And as I say, their rent would need to be somewhere between 0 and 150 a week, which means there'd need to be almost 100% subsidy. If you earn between 30 and 50% of area median income, that's about 10% of households. It's slightly underestimated because of ID's categories. Again, the amount of rent that you can pay for that 160,000 households is quite a bit lower than most of the rental properties that you'd find of appropriate size. Even if you're talking about low-income households, 50 to 80% of median income, a little bit around 20% of households, you're talking about a rent per week, which is very difficult to find well located in relation to public transport and services. What we're starting to do these days, and it's very disturbing, is include moderate people in the need of subsidy for housing affordability. And again, even if you're a moderate income person earning between 80 to 120% of median income, about 190,000 households, the amount of rent that you're going to pay is going to make it very difficult for you to find rental or home ownership options within metropolitan Melbourne. So that's about almost 900,000 households who should be paying less than $600 a week for rent or less than $312,000 for an owned unit. And Infrastructure Victoria talks about a huge deficit of social housing units. When it says 30,000 households, that's what it sees as feasible in the next 10 years. There are also almost 10,000 public housing units that are nearing obsolescence. They've been very poorly maintained. There's a 10-year waiting list for public housing. And Plan Melbourne, because of population growth statistics or projections, says that there's going to need to be 1.6 million new homes by 2030. That's about 50,000 new units a year, of which about 50% will need to be affordable to median income households. Now, what's happening under essentially a business as usual scenario, and as I say, there's some signs of hope from the state government, is a 74% increase in those sleeping rough in CBD over the past 2 years, increasing sprawl, increasing traffic congestions, as households are basically told to flee to areas outside the growth boundary without public transport, without schools, which is very unaffordable and unhealthy living. And of course, there's health and infrastructure costs to Australia as a whole, and there a recent research supported by the University of Melbourne found a 2.7 to 1 cost-benefit ratio to providing housing versus health services to the homeless. And it's really important to bring it down to the human element, because every new affordable home is a life saved, but sometimes it's hard to hear the quiet voices of people who've been living in communities for a long time. Of course, the fastest growing group of people in affordability stress are older women, and simply can't afford the areas that they've lived in, possibly brought up children throughout their lives. So what can be done? We see that when the federal government steps in, as it did with the Social Housing Initiative, you can get a big jump in housing units over a relatively short period of time. The trick is having sustainable funding once you gear up social housing or public housing providers to have those units. So keeping these kinds of levels of 12% of all housing up over a long period of time. You can have a goal of a home for everyone, which is certainly what the Labour Party platform talks about in Victoria, and then add to that specified targets with annual reports towards those specified targets, as the City of Vancouver does. Another thing that the City of Vancouver does is it's created a purpose-built agency. There's at least 14 different state government departments or agencies with skin in the game of affordable housing, but you do need a coordinated effort to bring together the multiplicity of partners, including the private sector, who provide 97% of housing, in order to make things happen. You can have inclusionary housing provisions. So in London, it's 35% inclusionary housing now, and the mayor has promised 50% by 2020, which is in 3 years. In New York, there's a range of mechanisms that I won't get into right now, but basically it's between 20 and 50% affordable housing, inclusionary housing provision in certainly all of central New York. You can have very spatialized targets, preferably at the local government area, and particularly focusing on areas that already have 20-minute city infrastructure in place. And our new postdoctoral research fellow, Matt Palm, is going to be mapping out some of those places that have infrastructure and government land and link infrastructure improvements to more affordable housing. There's a furphy, something that isn't particularly true, that if you build affordable housing, that's somehow going to make the area less of interest to private developers. But actually in the 1970s, there was a whole neighborhood of 10,000 people near downtown Toronto, like South Bank or Docklands, where 50% of the housing was social housing. That came first with the social infrastructure in the ground floors. There was no problem selling the condominiums. That kind of integrated planning for new neighborhoods. Singapore enforces a range of apartment sizes in each building and has really excellent infrastructure on the ground floor. Again, to go back to Vancouver, it's had high density housing for families with children, guidelines recognizing the fact that some households will be raising children in apartments since 1992 that has a minimum number of family units in housing, maximum walking distances, and a post-occupancy evaluation in a large central city high-rise development, Falls Creek, found that 90% of the adults and the children really liked living there. Yikes. So what Transforming Housing is going to be doing is continuing to work on policy development and implementation, innovative project delivery and evaluation, sectoral development, and developing a new generation of engaged housing researchers. And we're working on a number of different initiatives that you'll be hearing about tonight, such as the Affordable Housing Challenge, documenting some innovation. We're going to be having a showcase of innovation in housing and supporting state government capacity. And finally, the question isn't what to do. There's a lot of research-based evidence out there. It's a question of how to get there from here, and we've been promoting a deliberative consensus-based approach, which you'll be hearing about more in the next talk. And basically, we believe that the University of Melbourne, other universities, can be mediators and creators of safe spaces to share ideas and build partnerships based on trust and mutual interest. That's all I have to say. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kate Raynor, postdoctoral research fellow with Transforming Housing.
All right, welcome everyone. It is my great pleasure and privilege to be presenting some of the findings from a housing summit that we hosted in the beginning of June this year. And as I look around, there are quite a few people in this room who were actually there at the event, so I hope that I can do it justice. So to give you a very brief outline of what we did, we hosted a summit here at the Woodward Centre on Pelham Street, and we had 50 attendees, and we targeted 6 key groups that we thought were really important in this housing affordability debate. So we were speaking to researchers, the state government, local government, private developers, the investment community, and the not-for-profit housing associations, and trying to bring all of these different parties together to create some new ideas, spark some new ideas. And essentially what we did is we started out with a background paper, and there is some out there, they may all be gone by now, and there's also going to be posters that reflect that background paper in the Dulux Gallery when we go up for drinks later. And essentially, we put together a background paper that had 10 key ideas that we thought the housing industry was interested in the moment, and were really shaping what was occurring in the housing market over the next 3 to 5 years, and asked the attendees, what did they think about it? So we got some good feedback from that. We also had a wonderful facilitator in Kimbra White, who focused really strongly that day on bringing people together to have small conversations. And so we forced private developers and local planners and state planners all together to get them to have conversations to start to come up with new ideas. So what we ended up with was 9 solutions that you'll find in this report here. There was actually more than 9 solutions, but I exercised my editorial prerogative and mushed a few together, the ones that were very similar, or cut some of them that had other things reflected in other ideas. So if you were there and your idea isn't perfectly reflected, then that is entirely my fault, and you can come yell at me later. And we also came up with 5 renewed research directions or ideas based on the feedback that we got. Because again, as a research partnership that is connected to industry, we're also interested in creating research outputs that are useful to the people that we're working with. So I should acknowledge at this point that the summit was actually the second summit that Transforming Housing has hosted. The first one occurred in 2015. And I think that 2015 summit was actually really well placed because it helped, we think, to kind of form some of those conversations that were then embedded in what occurred in Plan Melbourne and in Homes for Victorians. So we'd like to think that as a group, the Transforming Housing Partnership is really helping to bring people together and foster those conversations that are going to lead to better affordable housing outcomes. We also found that a key difference between the 2015 and the 2017 summit was that there was a lot more optimism in the room. And I know Carolyn has just painted a really, really bleak picture for us, but I'm here to be, I guess, the happy news, or the spike of optimism, in that I think that things have changed. And that's, as Carolyn said, partially due to some of this policy that's come out of the state government recently. So we've had Plan Melbourne, we've had Homes for Victorians, and of course we've had the federal announcement pertaining to the bond aggregator model, which is something that we're really interested in looking more into as a research group and as a research partnership. And we've also had the Infrastructure Victoria 30-year strategy come out since the 2015 summit. And I think one of the most important things that came out of that was this indication that affordable housing is critical infrastructure. So starting to change the way that we frame housing, not as social welfare necessarily, not as property, not as something to invest in, but as infrastructure, which changes the way we fund it and changes the way that we think about it. We also had many familiar faces between the 2015 and 2017 summit, but it was really nice to have new players coming into the fold of affordable housing, and we really like to encourage that. So one of the exercises that we ran was giving people these first 10 ideas and asking them, how close do we think they are to being applied? And some of the feedback we got, for example, on the left there, is about the public housing renewal program. And there was lots of concern about it. It's not a perfect situation, but people felt like it was something that was happening, it was something tangible, and so it's quite green. On the other side, we have what the federal government's contribution to affordable housing, and all of the red up there kind of reflects the fact that people are confused, or they're still waiting to see what's going to come down in terms of the bond aggregator model and other aspects like that. So I'm going to talk through this document a bit, but I'm going to link it back to what we were trying to achieve in putting together the Housing Summit. So we had 3 key goals, and the first, and as a collaborative partnership, this is always one of our goals, was to work collaboratively and to build stronger connections between different people in the housing industry, and to take action on affordable housing. The second is to further contribute to good affordable housing policy, and the third was to identify key actions that we could do, those people in the room could do in the next 3 to 5 years to get affordable housing on the ground. And we ran an exercise. I've blotted out the names so no one can be held accountable. We ran an exercise of asking all of the participants in the room to kind of put in some commitments or some offers that they could bring. And I thought that was really useful exercise in bringing that level of responsibility to the conversation. Another thing that I'm quite I'm quite excited about, I'm quite proud of in this document, is that throughout you will find that there's a call to action. And a lot of the people that Transforming Housing are working with at the moment put their names down to be contacts. So if there's aspects in this document that you find interesting, then quite often there are contacts in there or there are links. If the website links don't work, it is a hard copy. You can go to our website and the links work on the soft copy on our website as well. So we thought it was really important to, again, be holding people accountable to the actions that they could take. The second thing that we thought was really important was contributing to housing policy. And as I said before, we're really optimistic about the fact that there is housing policy and that the state government is acknowledging that this is something that needs to change and something that they need to contribute to. But what we really would like to see is something that transitions affordable housing from a piecemeal or an opportunistic idea to something that is embedded in policy and is occurring all of the time through a kind of consistent measure. So what we really want to see is something at the federal, the state level and the local level to really embed it. So we're talking about something like inclusionary zoning or tax incentives, a return to something like NRAS. So we think good policy is something that is going to result in a large-scale and consistent rollout of housing. And finally, there was a lot of discussion about the role of the metropolitan partnerships that were outlined in Plan Melbourne. And if you look at the Plan Melbourne 5-year implementation plan, then there is a focus on those metropolitan partnerships being a vehicle for creating housing targets and for holding different sub-regional areas accountable for housing targets. So we think that maybe that's a way forward and a way that we can direct our advocacy to start to do something in that area. So finally, we talked about identifying key actions. And there's 9 ideas, as I said before. I mushed a few together. But there are 9 key ideas in this document. And I'm only going to talk about a few because we don't have time. But I'm going to talk about the ones that Transforming Housing has a goal to do some research and to support explicitly. So the first one is attracting and facilitating institutional investment in affordable housing, and that's been all through the news in the last few days and further back as well. So that's something that we think is really important. The next is promoting as-of-right secondary dwellings. So that's your granny flats and studios, that kind of thing. The next is partnerships between government, not-for-profit and private sector. And also leveraging state government land for affordable housing. I should also acknowledge, while this slide is up, that we have an action for encouraging small investors to lease affordable housing to housing associations. And Donald is in the front row down here, so that's an idea directly connected to him if you want to speak to him about it at some point. So the ideas that one of the groups came up with was to create a not-for-profit affordable housing infrastructure fund as a way for bringing together money for affordable housing that would leverage the bond aggregator model, the social housing growth fund and the future fund, and that would be supplemented by government incentives to make investment financially viable. And that's something that was a really big topic of conversation at this event, that it's all well and good to be talking about a bond aggregator model and a financial intermediary that is going to channel super funds into affordable housing, but we think that we need a long-term government incentive to make that financially viable, or it's not going to occur because the returns from affordable housing are not high enough without something like that. So we're advocating very strongly for long-term stable policy and incentives to support that. And we'll be supporting that with our research in 2018. The second thing that was discussed, and kind of seems like low-hanging fruit, is the promotion of as-of-right secondary dwellings. So having a granny flats out the back of your homes. And Plan Melbourne offers to streamline approvals for secondary dwellings, so that's something that's moving along, but we think it's really important to talk about the design outcomes and the social outcomes of that, and that's again something that we'll be interested in. We're also talking about partnerships, and this is going to be particularly important as social housing is increasingly delivered through private developers partnering with community housing providers, and those relationships are going to be very important. And we see that with the public housing renewal program and other things like that. And the goal is integrated communities, not developments that have the social housing on one side and then a great big wall and the private housing on the other, but developing a system where the community housing providers are a legitimate partner and have the capacity to have some power in that relationship. And as I've said before, Transforming Housing is deeply committed to having these conversations, and that's why we have events like this, and we run summits, and we make all of our research publicly available. And the final one was a discussion at the summit about focusing on ensuring that these initiatives that are coming out of Homes for Victorians are being delivered appropriately and are delivering good outcomes. So we're looking at things like public housing renewal and inclusionary housing on government land and holding them accountable. And that is something that Matt, who's up the back, the camera guy, will be looking at a bit more. So if you're interested in that topic, then he's your man to speak to. He'll be mapping and assessing surplus government land. So in my final moments, I would like to give a little dig to the next piece of research, or the next piece of advocacy and a public outreach that we're doing, which is a affordable housing showcase that will be held in this building in November. And it's really looking at pulling out some of that best practice information from different community housing providers or public housing examples, or even intentional communities, and trying to pull it all together and create a repository of information. So you have nomination sheets, and if you haven't, then we'll try and get them to you at some point. But if you have any projects in mind, then we're really open to hearing about them, and we might be adding them into the showcase. So there'll probably be about 20 projects that we focus on. It's a bit of a moving feast at the moment, but yeah, I encourage you to nominate away and also come along to that event. So that, I will hand over to Dave.
Old person with technology. Hi, my name is Dave Rebar. I am a professorial research fellow in the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research, where I lead its research team on economic and social disadvantage. I'm also the chief investigator for the ARC Center of Excellence on Children and Families over the life course. At the Melbourne Institute, I primarily conduct research on poverty outcomes and people's well-being, so I'm a people-focused economist. I'm going to be talking about a project that's taking a look at title transfers to Aboriginal Housing Victoria. But before I get started, I have a number of people to thank. So this research is supported by the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. It's also supported by the Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics, where the Melbourne Institute is located. I've also got a number of collaborators on this project. Aboriginal Housing Victoria is one of the collaborators. There are several people within the Melbourne Institute who are working on this. And there are also several researchers from the Melbourne School of Design, including Ilan, who will be speaking after me. So I'm going to talk about a new housing innovation, which is the transfer of about 1,500 properties from the state of Victoria to Aboriginal Housing Victoria. Carolyn had described this as a pilot project. It's actually anything but. This is a large-scale transfer of properties. It's a transfer of a large number of properties to a large, well-run Aboriginal community organization. So when we think of pilot projects or demonstration projects, we think about doing something small. Here, the state of Victoria is going all in terms of this particular initiative. Aboriginal Housing Victoria has been managing just over 1,500 properties on behalf of the state of Victoria. It serves Aboriginal Victorians throughout all of Victoria. So they have properties that are in Melbourne, but they've also got properties all throughout Victoria. Starting in July 2016, the state of Victoria began transferring the ownership of housing units from the state to Aboriginal Housing Victoria in a staged process. And that staged process involves about 500 properties going over to AHV each year in about July of each year. So 500 properties went over in July 2016. Another 500 just went over at the beginning of last month, and another, the remainder will go over in 2018. This is something that AHV has sought for a long time. It's a series of changes that will provide AHV with much more flexibility to develop and leverage the properties that it receives. More importantly, it's going to allow AHV to improve housing services and tenant outcomes for its clients. This is not the only place where transfers are taking place. So over the last 15 years, there have been a number of small and large-scale transfers that have taken place in Australia and also elsewhere. So property transfers are increasingly being used, and they're being considered as an additional step going forward. The property transfers typically take one of two forms. One of the forms is a management transfer, where an organization becomes responsible for the management of something that had previously been state or locally owned government housing. This transfer is different. So this transfer is transfer of the actual property titles. The actual properties become the property of AHV. Each type of transfer gives the organization that receives the properties more management flexibility. So there's more flexibility to maintain the properties, do other things. A big thing that happens when a community organization runs a housing project rather than a state or local government is that the tenants then become eligible for CRA. So one sort of game associated with this is by switching who has the property, you can actually get some revenue from the federal or from the Commonwealth government. Aboriginal Housing Victoria actually benefited from a management transfer several years ago. So the properties that it's currently managing actually were the result of a large management transfer some years ago, and they're now undergoing a title transfer. The main advantage with a title transfer is it gives AHV or whatever organization gets properties complete control over the properties, including the control to dispose of properties if they're no longer suitable for one reason or another, and also the ability to leverage the properties, so to borrow against the properties. It should be noted that although leveraging is sometimes a consideration in title transfers, it was not a consideration in this title transfer. So nobody's twisting AHV's arm to leverage these properties. Why would the state do this? Obviously, the loss to the state is the state has some assets that it paid for, and now it's letting go of these assets. So why would the state do this? Well, one of the reasons is the state's no longer responsible for maintenance. So in the same way that we saw that housing starts for community and government, for social housing had declined over time, we haven't seen any corresponding increase in maintenance or investment in the properties. And the state of Victoria has basically run up a giant deferred maintenance bill on its social housing. So one way that this benefits the state of Victoria is it's no longer responsible for the maintenance. So they've lost an asset, but they've also lost some costs associated with this. Another way that it might be beneficial to the state of Victoria is that if somehow AHV can transform these properties into more properties through leveraging, more efficient management, something else, this may be a way for the state of Victoria to actually generate more social housing than would have existed otherwise, again, without paying anything except giving away the titles. This is also a really cool research opportunity. So as I mentioned, I'm an economist. Economists are really interested in the way that we analyze impacts from policy changes. And this provides us with something that's called a natural experiment. So a lot of times when a property is turned over, when there's a title transfer, you're only looking at a small number of properties or a select set of properties or some weird characteristic associated with them. And you can never tell whether any of the outcomes that you observe associated with this property are actually something that redounds to the underlying characteristics of the property. So you really can't distinguish correlation from consequence here. This case is very different. So by 500 properties going over at a time, you set up a natural treatment and control situation. So you've got 500 properties that transfer initially, but you've got another 500 that don't transfer. They're all going to the same organization, so they're being run the same way. They're all coming from the same initial block of properties. So you've got something where you can naturally compare them, and the only thing that differs between the properties is one set was transferred and one set was not transferred. And we're going to take advantage of this in something that's called a difference in difference analysis. So within the transferred and the non-transferred properties, there might be something that's inherently different between those to begin with. We also know that as we move over time, there might be things that happen in Victoria and that happen to AHV that may change outcomes over time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some tenant outcomes and some property outcomes before a set of transfers and after a set of transfers for properties that did and didn't transfer. And we're going to compare the changes in one group to the changes in the other. And by comparing these changes, we're going to net out anything that's associated with whether the properties were in the transfer set or not in the transfer set, and anything that was time dependent. And we're going to look at two outcomes. So we're going to look at whether tenants exited from the properties over a given period, and then also for any vacancies that were generated, how quickly those vacancies were filled. So the initial data are tenancy and property data from AHV that we just received at the end of June 2017, just before the second set of transfers occurred. We're currently looking at two outcomes, tenancy exits and the length of tenancy spells. We're going to take a look at two window periods that are just before and just after the first transfers. So we'll take a look at 11 months before and an equal-sized 11 months after the transfer. And again, we're going to take a look at properties that did and didn't transfer. We've got a large number of properties, again, about 1,500 properties, large numbers of people in the control and not control group, so we should get some reliable estimates. So these are the results for tenancy exits. The blue line at the top takes a look at the proportion of tenancies at the beginning of a given 11-month period that were ended within that 11-month period among the non-transferred properties. The orange line shows the same things for the transferred properties. On the left, you see what the exit rate was before the transfer, and on the right, you see what the rates were after. What you can see from both graphs is that AHV had a slight increase in the proportion of tenancies that ended within an 11-month period over time. So both exit rates for the transferred and non-transferred properties went up, but they went up by identical 1.6%. There was absolutely zero difference in the changes in the tenancy rates. So zero difference in the effect of the transfer on the tenancy rates. These are the vacancy spells. These numbers are a little bit harder to look at. So these are the rates at which vacancies are ended. So it's sort of the opposite of how long the vacancies are. You can see that among the properties that were transferred, the properties that were transferred overall had a higher fill rate. So those vacancies tended to be shorter than the properties that were not transferred. The non-transferred properties had vacancy rates, fill rates that were lower. The vacancy fill rates changed over time, but they changed more for the not transferred properties than the transferred properties. So it looks like there may be a beneficial effect from the transfer on the vacancy spells. I have to emphasize that these are very, very, very preliminary findings. So these are hot off the presses findings. We've only examined the outcomes for the very first transfer. We haven't even looked at an entire year's period because we don't have data that extend past the first transfer for an entire year. The evidence is preliminary. We've focused more during this period on getting good measures than in actually doing the research because we're not going to have full results until all of the transfers have been completed. The preliminary results show no negative effects of the transfer on tenants. That's not necessarily a bad outcome. So for instance, if I were studying a generic drug, the outcome that I'd like to find from a generic drug is that it performs no worse than the drug that you paid lots and lots of money for. In this case, the state of Victoria is saving lots and lots of money through this, and it's getting exactly the same outcomes with no new addition of money here. But again, it's important to emphasize that these initial results are tentative and imprecise. And stay tuned. Hopefully in another 2 years, I can give you the final results on this. Thank you.
Hear me all right? Yeah. Right, thanks. So I'll talk about infrastructure, which certainly has links to housing, which I'll mention too. I do want to acknowledge Fan Chi Lu, who's sitting over there, who's my co-author and did some amazing work analyzing a very large and messy set of data. And so government decisions about how they allocate, how they distribute infrastructure funding determines who gets access or better access to health, education, transport, and all sorts of infrastructures and services. It really shapes the geography of the city, the geographies of advantage, locational disadvantage. And we have an interest in housing here, in affordable housing that's also has good access to all of those types of facilities. But we don't really have very good comprehensive empirical data about how those funds are actually distributed in Australian cities. We do have separate studies for, say, public transport or for health, but we don't really have studies that look at the full bundle of services that are accessible from different parts of the city. So this is the gap that Fanchia and I have been trying to address. And what we've done was comparing the spatial allocation of investment by the New South Wales and the Victorian state governments, specifically focusing on the metropolitan areas of Sydney and Melbourne, and looking how infrastructure funds were distributed. And we did it not only over a single year, but over a period of almost 20 years, from 1999 to 2015. So almost 2 decades there of infrastructure spending, so that really shapes that geography of access to services. Where we found our data was just looking at the state budgets. So for every state budget, every annual budget also has a state capital program. Sometimes it's called the infrastructure statement. And for Sydney and Melbourne, which is quite unusual, they actually have quite detailed information about the location of projects that are being funded, in addition to the amounts of funding that have gone to those projects. So we could really analyze that spatially, analyze the distribution. And the thing we were particularly interested in is measuring the level of investment that goes into an area against the socioeconomic status of that area, to see if there's some correlation there. And indeed, we did find some correlations, which I'll present to you. Before I present some, in a very brief and preliminary way, some of the key findings, I'll just acknowledge some limitations of the study. We've only looked at state capital funding, so we didn't look at local government funding, we didn't look at federal funding, so it doesn't still capture the full bundle of services, but it's getting there. State capital funding accounts for about 20 to 30% of the total budget, the state budget. And so it wouldn't include all recurrent funding, for example, salaries for state government staff, but it will include things like purchasing land, construction cost, improvements of existing facilities owned by government. Another limitation, we couldn't really, well, we did differentiate between very broad types of investments, such as transport, traffic. I'll show you those categories. But overall, we sort of looked at the total amount of investments going into areas. So we didn't really look at things like you could take into account that some types of investment are socially or economically more positive, produce positive outcomes for areas, whereas others, like having, I guess, an electricity facility in your area, is not necessarily a positive outcome for the local area. So we haven't looked at it in much detail in terms of the outcomes of investments, but the assumption there is that overall, getting more funding is beneficial. The last limitation I'll mention here is that we've only focused on the residential geography, and we're looking at how infrastructure goes into particular areas, measured socioeconomically in terms of who lives in those areas. But of course, the social geography of the city is more complex. People move, people work, so the geography is more complex than that. But here the focus is on the residential geography. So let me kind of try to run through some of those findings, and I'll read my notes. It'll just be a bit more precise. Finding 1, I'll present five findings. So over the last 30 years, total government capital investment statewide declined significantly, both as a percentage of GDP and in absolute dollars. For Victoria, we only had data going from 1999, but for New South Wales, we had data going back to 1988. And you can really see that decline between 1988 and about 2004. And this is what you can say was arguably that shift from a Keynesian economy to a neoliberal economy in terms of infrastructure investment. And it's very, very obvious when you look at New South Wales. I assume it's not too different for Victoria. So that was statewide. But then we looked what share of that funding went into the metropolitan areas, and we saw quite different results for Melbourne and Sydney. So in New South Wales, there's been a steady decline in the relative share of the capital funding that goes to the metropolitan area of Sydney. In contrast, in Melbourne, we're seeing an increased share for metropolitan Melbourne. And that's not directly correlated to changes in population, in the relative distribution of population. So it's a change in government priorities. And New South Wales and Victoria are going in different directions. Finding 3. When we have examined the different types of infrastructures that have been invested in, we have sort of 2 colors here. The blue colors, blue-grayish colors go for hard economic infrastructures, such as roads, urban development, public transport, versus the pinkish, yellowish colors, which are more soft social infrastructures, such as education and health. We can see a slight difference here, whereas Melbourne there's a slight trend towards soft infrastructure versus Sydney going more for the hard infrastructure. It's not a huge difference, but in some particular categories it is, and let me show you those categories. Education, that's a pretty big difference here. So Victoria or Melbourne, in Melbourne there's a much stronger priority for education facilities. And again, it's just a capital expenditure. When we look at roads and public transport, on both categories there's more investment or a higher proportion of investment in Sydney compared to Melbourne. And I think we didn't look at federal investment, but I think if we add that, it would probably even increase that gap. Now, one of the worrying findings we did see in Melbourne in this context is that the expenditure on public transports was particularly low in the inner city, which was surprising and I guess counterproductive if you think in terms of planning a compact city. The inner city is where you would like to see more public transport systems. So interestingly, Melbourne received a larger share of investment on utilities, such as water and electricity facilities, especially from 2009, which I think relates to the drought that happened before that, and I guess some of the policy changes as a result. In Sydney, we see more investment going into government facilities, 9%. It's quite a significant percentage of the infrastructure actually going to things like government offices. And a lot of them are in the CBD, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now this is probably the core of what we were really interested in, is trying to understand how investment is distributed against socioeconomic status of areas. Now if you look at the photo, ignoring the left side, it seems pretty similar distribution, a similar trend for both cities. It's quite redistributive in a way. There is a negative correlation between the socioeconomic status of the suburb and the amount of expenditure on average. So the least disadvantaged suburbs got the least amount of funding. But then where you see a real significant difference is where you look at the most disadvantaged suburbs. So in Melbourne, the most disadvantaged suburbs got the highest level of infrastructure investment, whereas in Sydney, the most disadvantaged suburbs got almost the lowest. They were only the only ones who got lower were the least disadvantaged suburbs. So this is a very concerning finding in terms of the way that the New South Wales government treats the most disadvantaged suburbs and compounds that disadvantage. To make things even worse for Sydney, this is also where we looked at where public housing is being investment in new public housing. It all goes into those most disadvantaged suburbs that are also very poorly serviced. So that compounds 2 types of locational disadvantage. One is the disadvantage or the the clustering, the spatial clustering of highly disadvantaged people, plus compounding disadvantage in access to services. Those two things together are very problematic. Melbourne's a bit different. A lot of the public housing that was built between 1999 and 2015 was in the north, in the city of Hume. It's actually a well-serviced area, as I showed you in the graphs, that the sort of disadvantaged areas actually receive quite significant infrastructure and services. But it's very far out and away, I guess, from some significant employment locations. And last but not least, so it's all underpinned, that sort of distributive pattern is underpinned by a very centralized approach to investment in both cities. So if you look at how much money goes per resident, if you just look at where people live, a resident in the CBD in Melbourne received every year a grant in the form of infrastructure worth $18,000. In Sydney, that's about $36,000 per resident. But of course, you can't measure it just by people living in the CBD because it's used also by workers and visitors. But even if we take that into account, we see that it's still very centralized in Sydney. It's still higher level of investment that goes into the CBD compared to the metropolitan average, and which is different from Melbourne. It's a bit lower in Melbourne than the metropolitan average. But in both cities, a very centralized approach to allocation of infrastructure funding, which is really shaped by and also kind of reinforces the structure of both cities. So I'll just sum up those sort of 5 or 6 findings. Increased prioritisation of the capital city in Victoria in contrast to declining priority for the capital city in New South Wales. Higher prioritisation of education infrastructure in Melbourne, or soft infrastructure more generally. A more redistributive approach in Melbourne, particularly in terms of looking at the most disadvantaged suburbs. And in Sydney, that's very problematic, that compound disadvantage of resource access and concentration of extremely disadvantaged populations, which is reinforced by locating public housing in the most disadvantaged areas. In Melbourne, the concerning trend is the location of new public housing in the outskirts of the city. And in both cities, investment is highly centralized. So yeah, I think you can see some good news, I guess, for Melbourne, but also some areas for significant improvement. And I'll finish here.
We have one more speaker, Catherine Brown, but she's going to speak for a shorter period of time about a new initiative, and I want you to start thinking of questions to ask because soon we're going to bring the speakers up for 20 minutes of questions. Over to you, Catherine.
I think that's right. Can you hear me? Yep. I'm the CEO of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. I'm not sure how many of you know much about philanthropy, but we're one of the funders of the Transforming Housing Partnership, and one of the key things that foundations can do is fund collaborations and research and exploring new ideas. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of where we've come from to come to the Affordable Housing Challenge, which we have actually kicked off, and I'll tell you about that at the end. But it might help you to know that we're Melbourne's community foundation. So we were set up in 1923 by the Lord Mayor of the day then to respond to the big issue of the day then was people returning from World War I with very severe injuries and disabilities, and the hospitals weren't equipped to cope. So that was the first fundraising campaign. So over all those years, 93 years, we've been funding different projects, whatever the big issues are for Melbourne. So sort of all the different waves of migration when people have needed support, HIV, AIDS, and then of course now, based on our research of what we really need now, affordable housing is right up there. Very, very big issue, obviously. Climate change mitigation and adaptation is another big issue, and also youth unemployment and older people, employment and unemployment. So I think we work on other issues, but we would see affordable housing as one of our biggest. So I'll just... I arrived at the foundation in 2011, and before my time, the board had already decided that homelessness was going to be something really key for the foundation to work on. So sort of been a bit of an intransigent problem for a while, and so we had two major grants over quite a number of years. First to the Salvation Army for a support service for people in Melbourne CBD who were rough sleeping and trying to support them out of homelessness, and also a research project that Sacred Heart Mission did about if you provide a lot of support services to people, what will be the long-term economic savings and benefits to them as well. So they were both important projects. They've both still going and have had quite a big effect, but we really thought it's actually going to be more important if we get to the underlying issues. So, the early intervention to prevent homelessness and then the increasing the supply of affordable housing have been the two things we've really focused on since 2012. So to try and learn, we've had a lot of contact with other foundations in Canada and the US and the UK. One of my team who's actually moved to another foundation, he went on a site visit in the US and met a lot of people, learnt a lot about what foundations were actually doing and what perhaps we could do. And also we had Julia Unwin, who's from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in the UK, and they're interesting because not only do they make grants like a foundation, they actually run housing. So they're very policy and research and focused as well. Michael Shapcott came out. He's an expert in affordable housing in Canada, so we learnt more. And then for a number of years now, we've supported the Transforming Housing. I've got it there as a think tank. It's been a source of wisdom for us on affordable housing. And what we learnt is that foundations can actually do quite a lot as social investors. And we were encouraged to be brave by many, many people. So in our granting program, we support capacity building of organisations who are working in areas that are important to us, but also innovation. So I can see Jeanette there. So there's some very good leaders from the not-for-profit sector in this space that we've supported. I really would give a big shout out to the Homeground Real Estate Agency, and the Women's Property Initiative have also got a real estate agency now. So I think anyone who's in the fortunate position of having a property to rent should actually think about either renting it out a little less than market rent to enable other people to sort of gain access to great properties and homes, but also you can actually pay the fees to Homeground Real Estate, and that funds their other services. So they're part of Launch Housing. So that's just an innovative example. And then we also supported Justice Connect's Homeless Law Service, which had an incredible effect enabling, put a social worker with the lawyers to enable women and children who are escaping issues in their tenancy. They had a lot of complex issues to actually sort things out and stay, and I think they're able to keep about 90 families in their private rental accommodation, and that's still going, and they got Victorian government funding. So they're the sort of things we kind of like to fund. And just a couple more. The first one just there, Launch Housing. Launch Housing are working on really an affordable housing development which will be in Coburg, and that's for women and families escaping family violence. And we're really one of the first funders. We've allocated $500,000 to them to help them leverage up more funding. And Vincent Care, we supported the redevelopment of Ozanam House, so that's what the photo at the bottom is what it's going to be like, and that's some of the people who live there. Anyone who's been there, it was the most depressing place, but it's now actually been all bulldozed and it's starting to be built, so that's great. And we gave them $600,000, but they leveraged $13 million of state government funding, and then a lot the builder actually has done a lot of it at cost, and they've sold land, and it's a more than $40 million project, and they've really leveraged every possible opportunity. Habitat for Humanity is an interesting project because we haven't just made a grant with them, we've actually made an impact investment. So I don't know if this is something you know about, but if you think of us as a foundation, we make nearly $10 million in grants in a year out, but actually our fund is $240 million. So can you imagine what we could do if we said, let's put a certain percent of that fund to work in line with our mission? So we have started to do that. There are some foundations in the US like Rockefeller and Heron Foundation, particularly Heron has everything as an impact investment. All their corpus is invested for a social or an environmental return as well as a financial return. So this is a trend that's really starting to take off. So we've got a small allocation, but we set it up with CEFA, which is Social Enterprise Finance Australia. So they're a social finance organisation. And we allocated $2 million into an affordable housing loan fund, and Habitat for Humanity have drawn down $1.4 million, and they're using it as working capital to speed up the houses that are being built by low-income families. And it's a sweat equity model, so the families actually put time and effort into the build, and they get 5% off the cost of the house, and then they also get no interest loans. So we're just looking for sort of interesting models to try and increase the supply of affordable housing. So the Affordable Housing Challenge, the board said to me at our last strategy day, well, what would you do if you could do anything? And I said, well, I'd like to allocate $1 million into a challenge to see what we could leverage in affordable housing, and I'd like to also add some impact investment. So I spoke with CEFA and they said yes, they'd be really interested in doing that. Spoke with Carolyn and quite a number of the people associated with transforming housing, and we've set up a committee. And the idea is that it'll encourage partnerships between not-for-profit organisations, so community housing associations or other not-for-profits, with commercial developers or builders to sort of demonstrate what can be done. The challenge process, I'm not going into lots of details, but I've got contact details at the end if you want documents. Where we are at the moment, we're in what we're calling the pre-challenge site selection. So we've sent out a request for proposals to all the local governments in the inner and middle ring of Melbourne, and also some of the larger church organisations and others that might own land, to ask people to put in sites. And we've got a lot of, some criteria about, obviously it has to be well located, near public transport, near services, schools and so on. And just looking what else. And also we need to make sure that in terms of planning, we don't want this to be a really long drawn-out process. We need to make sure the sites actually are within the actual local governments, either pre-approved or easily able to be approved for affordable housing. So that's closing on the 18th of August. So we want, we'd like lots of good sites, because then I can go and talk to all my other foundation friends and we might get a bit more happening. But we need at least one really great site. So, and then the next stage is the partnership, request for partnership proposals, and we're working on all those documents at the moment. And we actually got an advisor in the US who some of you probably heard speak last time here, David Rosen. So he's been helping us with the documents, because he's done it in the US a number of times. So obviously we adapt for Australia, but it's a kind of good risk management for us to have an expert like that on side. And then there's a power up session which is going to help people develop their proposals even more, and then a pitch, and then we'll award the grant. Our grant as a charitable foundation has to go to the charitable partner, but the impact investment could be used in a range of ways. So it's a bit different, but it's really trying to encourage some innovation, and the winning project hopefully will be scalable and replicable, because that's important. So the next slide has just got Karen, our program manager, and my email if you wanted to email or ring, and we can send you anything and provide a bit more information. But I would like to just acknowledge Transforming Housing. It's actually one of my favourite partnerships we have and favourite projects. It's just been really great because it informs us a lot to know what else we can fund and to give us confidence to do really interesting granting. So thank you.
Don't get too comfy. We're going to ask Kate and David and Alan and Catherine to sit here. I'm the person with the booming voice, so I'm going to stand here. And we have 10 minutes until we walk up a few stairs to the Dulux Gallery and do my favorite part of the evening, which is speed dating, where people talk to one another about affordable housing projects. But before we do that, and I'm leaving this up for a couple more minutes because I see you're all frantically writing this down, questions from the floor for our panel of excellent speakers. Yeah, just stand up and shout it out, okay?
Hi, thanks for the talk. My name is Ted, Colleague Architects. I work with the question at Capital. Just really interested in the impact investment model.
Yes.
Specifically to do with habitat for humanity. How does that model scale up with the people understanding people have to get involved and their sweat equity, but do somehow the money gets a return back to SEBA? So can you just explain a bit more about how that model works?
Yes. So impact investment is different from granting. So it's actually using our corpus to invest. So it has to meet our investment policy and it has to have a real return. So it's got to have a financial return. So we actually get a return from the Habitat for Humanity project through CEFA. Yeah, so it's really interesting. I mean, once you start doing it, you think, why isn't all our money like this? Yeah, and I think that's the shape of the future, really.
When we looked at affordable housing projects in the US and in Canada, there wasn't one project that had less than 6 sources of funding, and several had over 30 sources of funding. So it needs to be a complex set of funding in the current funding environment.
I mean, if you're interested in financing, it's called layered investment, and very often in these sort of projects, philanthropy will go in early and will take risk and will get a lower return than maybe some of the commercial investors that will come later. And some of the organisations that are applying, who might need a loan, and it's not just in housing but in other areas, they may not have a track record or be interesting to, say, a mainstream bank. So that's why the sort of impact investment can be really useful.
So that was a really useful question. Are there any other really useful questions from the floor? Matt, do you?
Speakers could just repeat the question.
Yeah, okay. Are there any other questions that direct the question and then the person will paraphrase your question? Yeah, Mike.
I guess the question maybe for you and Kate, and maybe they can pick it up just in relation to this notion of social housing as infrastructure, as key infrastructure, as social infrastructure. The argument certainly doesn't seem to be getting through at a point where it really matters, even with the Andrews government, but certainly at the federal Labor and the Libs as well. The argument doesn't seem to be getting through. And I'm wondering about what thoughts are about the particular approaches that we need to take in terms of advocacy to actually get that message through, especially to convince the economists who often, at the end of the day, run everything in terms
So maybe we'll start with Kate, and then we'll talk to our pet economist here. Kate. And Kate, paraphrase the question, yeah.
So paraphrase the question and tell me if I'm doing it wrong, is how do we disseminate that idea that affordable and social housing is critical infrastructure? I think one of the key things that transforming housing personally is not doing, but I know is currently happening, is a cost-benefit analysis. And I think that's a really important piece of work that is occurring at the moment that starts to quantify, I mean, what we already know, that people are going to be more productive and our societies are going to function better if the most vulnerable, and even the people who are above the most vulnerable, can, you know, put a roof over their head and feed themselves. So doing some of that research work around quantifying the value of that is happening. I think the other thing is being...
Well,
no.
There was that piece of research that's available from Melbourne Sustainable Societies Institute that was done by SGS Economics and Housing, the one that I cited earlier about the 2.7 to 1%. But there are researchers in several other universities, including Swinburne and RMIT, who are working on it right now. Yeah.
And I hear that some conversations were continued or begun at the Housing Summit with some of our partners who are tangentially linked to the project who are doing it, but we are not doing it in-house, the larger cost-benefit analysis aspect.
David, do you want to say anything about how you make the case for affordable housing as critical infrastructure?
Generally, what our institute does is focus on trying to provide convincing, rigorous evidence for these. So we focus primarily on trying to come up with impact evaluations. So, for instance, Catherine described the Sacred Heart mission, and our institute has been involved in a random assignment experiment to generate rigorous evidence from that you can bring to policymakers. With the project that we're working on with AHV, even though that's not a random assignment experiment, it's got some properties that are similar to a random assignment experiment. And again, we can provide rigorous evidence. Our organization tries to be neutral and would try to avoid advocacy. Just because we want to have a reputation as neutral arbiters of social science evidence.
Is there any, I think, Alana wants to say something to you. Sorry.
I was just going to say advocacy is a really sort of hot potato in charity land. And I think if you're working on policy and research, I think it's really an important role for philanthropy to be involved in. Obviously, you can't get involved in capital P party politics or anything like that, but there's certainly scope to fund research and provide evidence. As you say, that was what the Sacred Heart Mission project was about. David Rosen says that the asset class of private rental property as an aggregate is just the missing asset class in Australia, and that all the super funds should be in it. So it'll happen.
I guess notwithstanding all of what you've all said, I'll just also be a devil's advocate here and also remind that slide that I showed that infrastructure funding is declining generally, not just for housing. So calling housing infrastructure is not going to fix the problem on its own.
That's a very good point. I think we have time for one last question. So, Sophie, you're lucky last. You're lucky last. Sorry.
Well, their primary funding model is actually the rent and rent assistance that they bring in from tenants. So they have not been given any additional resources. So they got all these properties. They've now got the maintenance responsibility for all of these properties. But with nothing contributed by the government. So it's all got to come from efficiency. So here, findings that there is no negative impact is actually a very positive funding. You've transferred all of these resources. You really haven't paid an extra dime for them, and you're still getting outcomes that are as good, if not better, than when the state was in control.
Sorry, just a follow-up question. Do you think that will decline as the maintenance bills go higher? Or do you think in 5 years it'll be different?
Well, we think that over time that AHV will be able to realize more efficiencies over time. So in the short period of time, there's only so much that they can do. There's not going to be, you're not going to see a demonstrated impact on maintenance or anything in such a short period. But over the longer period, it should be better. Also, one thing with respect to the advocacy, one thing that I've really got to give AHV credit for is they didn't have to open up their books or their data. They did not have to let this project be analyzed. It's really a risk, and it really takes some courage from a organization to say, come study us. I think this is a great model. We'll let you take a look at everything. We'll let you report. And it isn't every organization that lets people do that, especially economists.
Yes, I think Alain has something that he wants to say. Alain?
The comment about your comment that it's that showing that things are not worse is good enough, but I think from the tenant's perspective, they need to sign up to those transfers, and it's not enough to tell them that things are not going to be worse. They actually need to get some incentive to transfer. So from that perspective, I think it is important to show improvements.
Mm-hmm. So, 3 things to say before I let you go. Just a reminder that I believe it's described in the running sheet as flocks descend on food and drink. I think I know who wrote that. The Dulux Gallery is just a half level up, so between the basement and the ground floor, that's number 1. And I believe food and drink is being prepared for the flocks even as we speak. On your way out, there's a lovely young lady named Stephanie who's standing at the back there. There's Stephanie. Stephanie will collect those ideas that you have for affordable housing exemplars towards our exhibit in November, which is going to be our next public event. And the last thing, and a very important thing, is to thank the people who made this night reality. Kate Raynor, who organized it, Matt Palm, who's filmed it, the MSD marketing folks for helping pull it together, as always, the funders of the project, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, Launch Housing, Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, and the Melbourne School of Design and the Melbourne Social Equity Institute for supporting transforming housing, our 4 amazing speakers as well as me, and of course, all of you in the audience. Let's have a round of applause, please. Enjoy your descent.